Okay, this is the Saturday, April 20, 2024 special workshop meeting concerning all things water. I'll call you to order now, and let's have a roll call, please.
Trustee Hallmax. Here. Trustee Lister.
Here.
Trustee Neolopoulos.
Here.
Trustee Underdone.
Here.
Trustee Rubin.
Here.
Trustee Scott.
Here.
President Rowan.
Here. We're not live streaming this meeting. The video recording, which we've been working on, will be available on the village's YouTube channel after the meeting. First item on the agenda is public comment. This portion of the meeting concerns anyone who wants to address the board about non-agenda items. If you have a comment about the agenda, you'll do that later. All comments should be limited to 3 minutes, and I'll notify the speaker when the time is up. Is there any public comment on a non-agenda, non-water item? Okay, so we'll get to why we're here. We're going to talk about the water issues in Glencoe, and I'll start with our village manager.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us on a sunny but cold spring Saturday morning. So today we are going to go through a pretty extensive presentation that is going to cover a lot of ground. It's not going to result in a lot of answers, and it's not necessarily intended to. It's intended to kind of re-engage the village board and the community in discussions that relate to the village's water utility. I think when you contemplate what services the village provides, few are as complex as our water system. And you'll learn in a little while how our water system functions, how our water plant functions, how we distribute water throughout the community that everybody uses when they turn on a faucet in their own homes or anywhere in our business districts. The intention today, as I mentioned, is really to re-engage on the subject that's been discussed on and off for many decades. Most recently, and we'll talk about this briefly in a little while, there was extensive review and discussion in 2013, 14, and 15. We'll give some historical context on that. There hasn't been much discussion since that time. We'll give some historical context on that. But we are coming to a point where we believe that in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to need to make some decisions that are substantial relative to reinvestment in our water plant. We have been, really since 2018, doing a great deal more investment in our distribution system, which consists of 58 miles of underground water mains, among many other component parts, which the staff will walk you through. And when you aggregate those things together, I would say the most significant financial impacts that the village will have to navigate relate to how we invest in those component parts of our infrastructure network. So I'm going to get out of the way, but before I do that, I want to just introduce a few people who the board may not see very frequently, some that you see quite a bit that are going to be part of today's presentation or available to answer questions as we go through this. Monica Sarna is our Public Works Director. Obviously, everybody sees Monica more frequently. Alex Urbancic is our Water Plant Superintendent, who is in charge of ensuring our production facility operates quietly, effectively, efficiently, 365 days a year. Don Perk is our Public Works General Superintendent, and under his oversight is Frank Coletti, who's our Water Distribution Supervisor. Between those two, they are responsible for ensuring that the water that leaves the plant gets to where it's supposed to go, and does so in a way that we all take for granted. That's okay. We want it to be that way, but it does underscore the critical importance when something goes wrong, when we have a water main break, when we have an issue that has to be resolved. But they're the ones that are going to be focused on that. Vicki Larson's Deputy Village Manager, CFO. She'll be talking a little bit later about some of the financial impacts that we're working through. And then we have a number of other staff who are supporting the overall discussion around our water utility. We've got Maudsley, our Public Works Management Analyst, Ben Weiberg, our Assistant Village Manager, Sammy Hansel, our Communications Manager, Taylor Baxter, Development Services Director, and Margaret Schwartz, our Assistant CFO. I think that was all the staff that I have here today. We're all excited to be here. A couple of notes before we get started, and Monica's going to walk through a number of things. This PowerPoint presentation is going to be loaded to the village's website after this is over. So anybody who is here this morning and wants to refer to it, you'll be able to do so. We will make sure that the community is aware of it. We are also recording this meeting in two different ways in hopes that since the AV capabilities of this room are not ideal, we're doubling back so that we at least have what we hope will be at least one good recording. So we're able to post that as well. There will be time throughout the presentation for comments and questions from the board. And this really is intended to be more of an informal discussion than anything. At the end of today, we're not looking for direction. Staff isn't at a point yet where direction is necessary, but we know that this is a long road. These are projects that have runways that can run 10 to 20 years. And as we start this process, we want to just bring everybody kind of to the same place so that as these conversations, as this analysis, and as the work that staff will do over the coming years gets underway, we're all just kind of starting from the same point. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way. Monica is going to walk us through a pretty extensive presentation, and we look forward to enjoying a Saturday morning together. Thanks for being here.
All right, thank you, Phil. As Phil said, anytime feel free to interrupt me, but I will try to pause at certain breaks in the presentation to see if you have questions. So feel free to write them down, or this is an open discussion as we go through. And again, this is informational only. We will be talking about a lot of things where I feel like, as probably the staff has witnessed in preparing for this, it's tempting to want to dive in and try to make a decision or have final answers. That's the whole point, is getting everybody on the same page and figuring out what else do we need to know. So, but again, there's no decisions that need to be made today. We're just informational. So, the things we'll be talking about today. Here's our agenda. We're going to start at a high level water overview and bring it down more specific to an overview of our Glencoe water system. And then we're going to go into three main topics, talking about our water plant, talking about what it would look like if we were to relocate or rebuild it. We'll take a quick break. And then we'll come back and talk about our neighboring water supplies. So what are our neighbors doing? What kind of partnerships could we form with them in the future of our water supply? And then we'll wrap it up with a financial discussion and open up for any other discussions. All right? So start with the high level. Looking at Illinois, 56% of Illinois residents get their water from Lake Michigan. This is, we obviously have high density in the Chicagoland area, but elsewhere throughout Illinois, we have either groundwater or surface water. So in the direct Chicagoland area, a lot of our residents can get surface water from the Fox or Kankakee River, but or else it's like a mix of groundwater or well water. We dive in closer to Cook County. What you'll see, these dark gray lines along here are the water distribution lines. And so you can see all along Lake Michigan, there are several intakes. So you can see the northern suburbs, we have quite a few. The city city of Chicago has two main ones, and then again on the south suburbs there's a couple more intakes as well. What I want to point out here is the city of Chicago is a main producer of water in Cook County. So between the Jardine water plant and the Eugene Sawyer water plant, they can produce 1 billion gallons of water a day, which is a whole lot. And Alex will get into the details of our plant, but they're just a massive water supplier. They supply water all throughout Cook County, DuPage County, and even Will County. And I know Phil will be talking about later, but Joliet's going to be one of the newest additions to the Lake Michigan water in the coming years as well. They're the newest, largest consumers that are coming online. So I want to talk about what drives water production as far as regulations go. The biggest one is the Safe Drinking Water Act. This is a federal act, came from Congress in 1974, and it basically just ensures a standard quality of water. The biggest thing that came out of this is the CCR. It's an annual report, our consumer confidence report talking about water quality. All of ours are posted on our website. It's something that every water producer has to adhere to. There's also other regulations like the EPA's 2021 lead and copper rule revisions that have come out. All of those regulations are enforced at a state level. So we report everything to the IEPA, the Illinois EPA. Their regulations match the federal regulations, and Illinois, being a progressive state, have some additional regulations on top of that as well. So just as the federal government has a lead and copper rule, IEPA has their Lead Service Line Replacement Unification Act that enforces that federal regulation. Illinois is unique in the fact that there is regulation allocating how much water we can pull from Lake Michigan. So it's the IDNR is the one who enforces that. So actually, all of the Great Lakes are regulated on how much water can be pulled, and that's through the Great Lakes Compact. Illinois and Wisconsin are a little unique in the fact that they are regulated under a Supreme Court decree. I'm not a history buff, I'm not going to go into all the details of that, but what it means is that Illinois can pull about 2.1 billion gallons of water a day from Lake Michigan. And the IDNR oversees that and regulates that. That 2.1 billion gallons a day is a rolling 40-year average. And then there's a couple other departments that chime in as well, but those are the three main hitters that regulate how we produce our water. So both of these graphs are from the IDNR, and I think it's really important to point out. The first one is showing our water allocation, how much water we're pulling from Lake Michigan from the early 1990s. And as you can see, there's a significant decline. A lot of this was through IDNR's effort to conserve our water usage. They want to make sure that we're using it responsibly, but also, I think as technology has progressed through the years, we're seeing a lot more water efficient fixtures. So it's a combination of conservation and efficiency. The first graph shows, I think it's like 370 million gallons per day decline in water usage since the early 1990s. There are a couple spikes you'll see. Those were years of drought. But overall, it was a decline in water usage.
You don't have to stop at 15, that stops at 17, you want more updated data?
There is a projection probably on the newest report that just came out about our water allocation.
Directionally, we're...
Yeah. So the second one, like you pointed out, is a bit newer. It goes to 2017. This one I just wanted to point out too. I mean, the black line is showing how much water they had allocated. So they had projected a slight increase, right? But in reality, our water usage continued to go down. So just pointing out that overall we are seeing a decline in how much water we're using. And then, as I said earlier, Joliet is coming online. They're going to start using Lake Michigan water. We have that available allocation. So in reading through all the history, I think at some point Illinois was using about 95% of our water allocation. Now we're closer to 75% of our water allocation. Again, it's a rolling average. It's a complex how they project and allocate and calculate all of that, but safe to say there is available water still from Lake Michigan. I guess I'm trying to get across. We should also talk about climate change and how that impacts Lake Michigan as our water source. So one of the biggest threats to us with climate change is the volatile lake levels of Lake Michigan. And as you can see throughout the years, the lake level changes quite a bit. But what we're seeing in the last 10, 20 years is the biggest changes from very low levels to very high levels. And each extreme presents its own challenge. So high levels, obviously we're worried about our infrastructure along the lake, which our water plant is right on the lake. And so when we have high lake levels, we want to make sure that we're, fortifying and protecting our infrastructure along the lake. But when we have low levels, that can cause problem for our water intakes.
Can I just jump in real quick with just an anecdotal point there? So if you look at the most recent few years, you see this pretty substantial swing. So back, we had a pretty substantial and hot year in 2012, pretty major drought that year. Lake levels were historically low. By 2019, we had swung completely the other way, and we were at historic highs, to the point at which all of the lakeshore communities who operate water treatment plants were working together to draft requests from our federal legislators for emergency funding to fortify our water treatment facilities because of substantial and pretty severe winter storms. We were seeing water where we had never seen water before around our plants. And so I just bring that up to give you kind of a sense of when we talk about volatile lake levels, it's really volatile. You go from historic low to historic high in less than 10 years. And there are significant problems with both of those from the standpoint of production. So just an anecdotal point.
And I'll add that current lake level is about 1.5 feet lower than it was at the max in 2020. Lower? Yes.
All right. Then I want to touch on the newest PFAS regulations. They actually just came out 10 days ago. So on April 10th of this year, the EPA finalized the National Primary Drinking Water Regulation, establishing enforceable levels for PFAS. We knew this was coming. We've kind of been talking about it for a while, but the ruling has been finalized, and this chart shows what we're looking at. The two most common types of PFAS, the PFOA and the PFOS, those were capped at 4 parts per trillion. That is the lowest level of which you can test for those chemicals at a reliable rate. So anything below, you can test the same water sample and get different readings. But at 4, you can get a reliable reading. So that was kind of anticipated. And then the other less common PFAS, those were capped at 10 parts per trillion. So as I was saying earlier, we are enforced through the IEPA. They have required since March of 2021 that we would be testing for PFAS. So we have our historical records since March of 2021 in which we've been testing for PFAS. Most of our testing has come back at non-detectable rates. We have gotten a couple that are around 2, but again, those are below the enforceable thresholds overall. So, I guess one of the takeaways is we don't have to do anything right now. besides continuing to monitor, but this is something that we're gonna have to continue monitoring in the future. I will say, that we were made aware that Wilmette is actually doing a study right now to understand what they can do to react to the regulations, because at the time they didn't know. But what they're looking at is trying to remove a very small amount of something from the water. So they're looking at new technology for different materials in our filter beds. This may make more sense as Alex goes through our water treatment plant discussions, but trying to figure out the way to say this is it's very hard to remove a little bit of nothing. Is that the right way to say it?
Yes.
Okay, you know, versus.
It's hard to remove
Some
something
water
you
that we're drinking.
can't scientifically detect, because
Yes.
you don't know if your treatment process is removing it or not, if you already can't detect it.
Correct. So it's a challenging thing. Mostly to say is that if we wanted to do anything to react to our current levels, it's very challenging. Not to say that we don't want to. So we're going to be coordinating with Winnetka and trying to understand the results of their study. But you know, until levels got to above 4, it's very hard to react to anything to change our process. So it's just something we'll be continuing to monitor. And you know, overall, this is a great example of regulations and how it can impact the future of our water production, right? This is just one regulation that came out. We're not changing anything right now, but many water producers throughout the U.S. have had to make or will have to make significant changes in the next 5 years to react to this, which will be a costly investment. So I'm going to take a quick pause. I'm done with regulations, kind of like the high-level overview of Illinois, before we dive into Glencoe specific. Any questions?
Can I just add one thing
Yeah.
to Monica's points where, I think the other point relative to the regulatory environment is that it is a moving target. PFAS chemicals have been around for nearly 100 years, right? And have been tracked by the EPA starting in the 1970s. The EPA has just now, in 2024, set any sort of limits relative to public water supplies. I say that only from the standpoint of we may not know even 5 to 10 years from now what other regulatory environment we may have to contend with. That's just a aspect of water production, and it's something that Alex is talking with his colleagues about all the time. It's something that you may remember, 10 to 15 years ago, there were a lot of conversations about pharmaceuticals and removing pharmaceuticals that had been for a long time. People have been encouraged to flush them down toilets rather than recycle them appropriately. That practice led to problems from a production standpoint, which led to a change in the way that we handle unused pharmaceuticals. So I say all of that to just kind of underscore the kind of dynamic nature of the regulatory environment. There are the things we know, there are the things that we've been regulating against for a long time from the standpoint of removing from our water system, and there will be more things that come at us in the future. So,
Glencoe specific, here's a snapshot of our water distribution system in GIS. The teardrop is indication of where our water plant is, right along the lake, and then the 2 cylinders are representing where we have storage. So right at the lakefront, right by the plant, we have a 2 million gallon underground reservoir. And then out by the Edens, we have our elevated tank, which is 500,000 gallons. That's our water tower out there. So we maintain 58 miles of water main throughout town. That varies from 4 inches to 16-inch of water main, and we service over 3,100 residents or service lines. And there's a lot of infrastructure that goes with that, so all of the meters and the fire hydrants and the valves. all of that is critical to making sure that we can, operate our water distribution system. And that all requires annual maintenance and investment. So, I think one of the important things to point out too is, our fire hydrants is critical to our emergency response teams, but it is one of the things that does drive how our distribution system operates. Fire flow is one of the most important things that we look at when we look at maintaining system pressure in our distribution system. And we'll have a couple more graphs to look at later on in the presentation. All right. So in 2016, we did a study with Strand Engineering to look at our water distribution system. And the outcome of that was a 20-year capital improvement plan. So this map in the upper right-hand corner was from that study. All the red dots were historical water main breaks. We've had more since 2015, but that just goes to show, how many we were dealing with. And this graph here is also showing how many water main breaks we were having per year. So starting in 2016, that red line there, it's showing when we started working on this capital improvement plan. And luckily, I feel like we can see a little downward trend on the number of water main breaks that we're dealing with. But it just goes to show that, the investment that we're putting into our distribution system is important. And it's something that I guess we should have been doing probably on a more consistent basis. So since 2016, we've replaced 15,000 linear feet of water main. We've also replaced all of the water meters in our system. I think you've heard me talk about our leak detection program. Phase 1 has been implemented. We're working on phase 2 and 3 this year. And we also have the regulations from the Lead Service Line Replacement Act. And so we've been working on replacing lead services through our cost sharing program. All of those things have been a really good investment into our distribution system. One of the driving forces for this, especially the leak detection system, is through the IDNR. Remember I was talking about conservation and efficiency? They have proposed that they want to see a non-revenue water loss of 10%. So non-revenue water is water that goes to be made in the plant and it doesn't make it to the water meters for us to charge money for. It's lost somewhere in the system. And so through our leak detection, or meter replacement, we've been able to decrease the amount of water that is lost within our system. I know in one of the earlier memos when we were talking about the workshop, I included a graphic of the estimated amount of water lost in Illinois, which equated to 1.3 Sears Towers. What is it called now? It's not Sears. Willis, thank you. Okay, 1.3 Willis Towers a year, which is just an insane amount of water that is lost somewhere in our system. And so I think all of these things are helping with that to reduce it, but they are costly investments. So this is kind of one component of the distribution system of what we're working towards.
And currently, what are our systems telling us we're losing?
About 24, 25%.
We were around 26 to 28, and we're down about 22, 23% currently.
So it's been on a continual downward, but 10% is going to be a little hard to achieve.
Correct.
I mean, not only for us, but for everybody. I think it's a challenge that all of our neighbors are.
Can we just give a little context? What are the sources of water loss?
Sources of water loss are predominantly either water main breaks that don't surface, and the second highest contributor is leaking lead service lines. With this leak detection that we've been deploying, 90% of the hits we're getting for a leak have been on a lead service line that's leaking, doesn't surface, and it's usually either getting into the sanitary or the storm sewer. And same with water main breaks. If they're small enough, generally they're going directly into a storm sewer or a sanitary sewer through infiltration.
Another component that I want to talk about with our distribution system is our emergency interconnects that we have with our neighbors. So there's three main ones that we have with Highland Park up to the north, Northbrook to our west, and Winnetka to the south. We do have an interconnect with Northfield, but that is a one-way. We provide them water. The water does not come back the other way. But with all of these, I think it's important to note that it is important that we maintain them and utilize them in case of emergency. So luckily, in the past 10 years, the only one we've had to utilize is the one with Northbrook, and that was during the Skokie Lagoon main installation. We haven't had to utilize these for any emergencies, but it is something that's important for us to invest in and look at because it creates resiliency and redundancy to our system in case of emergencies. As we were having discussions with our neighbors about their water systems, we talked to each of them about our existing interconnects. One story I thought that was interesting here is that Wilmette and Winnetka just recently invested in one of their interconnects, and they added a booster station there. I think Winnetka was the one who instigated it. They wanted that emergency interconnect resiliency, but in the past couple of years, Wilmette has actually used it more often than Winnetka. So it just kind of goes to show it benefits everybody, no matter who's the initiator or the one asking for it. It just benefits all water systems overall to make sure that we have these resilient interconnects.
You'll see in a few minutes when Monica talks about kind of the specific producers along the shore, how many there are. And that is an interesting point in that it's important from an emergency interconnect perspective as well. None of us have the capability of supporting any of the other ones fully if there were catastrophic damage done to somebody's treatment facility or a major transmission line. But these interconnects serve to provide at least some additional capacity across all of our communities. But they're also, in most cases, undersized and underutilized. As Monica said, we don't typically, thankfully, have to swing those open in order to provide water service. But that is going to be an area that we're going to be focusing on in the next several years to begin to plan for how we enhance those interconnects. But we'll talk more about that later on.
Yeah, and I guess I should point out with the Hubbardwood streetscape, I think that's going to be our next opportunity to upgrade that interconnect. So Winnetka's already talked to us about that, but they've got that on their radar. That'll probably be a joint project that we'll be working on in the next couple of years. So any questions on Glencoe's water system? Alright, so that's kind of our high level water overview from Illinois down to Glencoe. Here are the three main topics we're going to be talking about today. And these topics are going to relate much more to the water plant. So I was just talking about our water distribution system, which is an important component of water. But in these three options, this is more specific to our water plant water production. So the three things we're going to be looking at is investing in our existing water plant and what that looks like. If we could rebuild or relocate our water plant, and exploring potential water partnerships. So put these numbers on the slides so you know what topic we're on, so you'll see them in the bottom corner. But I guess the way we look at this is in the many options of the future of our water supply, they'll probably fall into one of these three categories. So there are many iterations. This is kind of the big decision tree, and from there are many options of which we could do.
That's right. Can we just jump right back?
Yeah.
I was looking back at our 2016 water system. Do we have any? So we're going by this to figure out water mains to replace. It's like a 20-30 year program, right, between 2018 and 2038. We plan to revisit this anytime soon.
We've talked about it.
But was also wondering about our valves. I don't really see a mention of them in here. Do we have any plan for those?
So the valve projects came out of our valve exercising program, which was separate from the study. We have talked about revisiting the 2016 study. Right now, we're using it kind of as a general guideline as we move forward, but we are tweaking it and modifying it. I think the 2023 Beach Road transmission main project is it's one of those emergencies that you need to react to, and it wasn't planned for. So obviously the 20-year plan is going to get derailed. I think also the lead service line replacement regulations has looking at these in a little different way to say, can we prioritize different projects based on where we have lead services? So it's a guideline, and we have questioned we might update it, but I think we have kind of the next at least 5 years planned out of water main replacements for where we want to go. So we'll keep looking at it depending on how close are we sticking to the plan and how confident do we feel moving forward with the projects that are presented to us.
I'd just add to Monica's points. The 2016 plan was probably the first significant system-wide analysis that we have done in a very long time. And almost immediately, there were other components that were changed in terms of the plan itself, and specifically related the rate study that came the next year. So we built out, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we built out a rate structure to pay for the plans, or the components of the plan that needed to be replaced or were called out in that. But in addition to the points that Monica just brought up, we did make some significant changes in trajectory because of a series of things that came up. The water meters, for instance, were not necessarily called out in the plan as a necessary change, but we had 15 different types of meters across the community that we were not confident were appropriately metering the water that was being used. So that was a change, a pretty substantial one. As emergencies have come up, we have made changes. Most significantly, that plan recommends relocating the elevated tank to the other side of the Edens Expressway because of, at the time, the condition of the main that travels under the Skokie Lagoons. As the board knows, really from 2020 to 2023, we made emergency replacement. We did emergency replacement of that line because it presented itself. And then the federal government made some money available, and we were able to finish that project, which took finding a new location and a new elevated tank off the table for a while. So while things have gotten added, some things have gotten removed, and so as it moves, it is a bit more fluid, no pun intended, but absolutely something that we've talked about wanting to sit down and especially look at the chronic breakers. Now that we're getting so much more information about leak detection across the entire system, we're also able to utilize that data to help us to reprioritize.
I think we sound like we're on the right track.
Great question.
Yeah.
Great question.
Try to jump in.
All right. So before we dive into these three main topics, there's just one thing I want to note, which is the 2015's water supply planning report. And in that, I'm not going to go into all this information. It's a lot of information on the slide, but the three main items that were looked at in the 2015 report were rehabilitation of an existing water plant, construction of a new water plant, or purchasing drinking water from our neighbors. If we look, it's very similar to what we're going to talk about today. And that's why I provided with some FAQs from 2015 that are still relevant. But one thing I want to point out, there are things that have changed. So our topics today, while very similar to 2015, are going to be different. So like Phil just said, one of the main things that's changed is the Skokie Lagoon main replacement that took place from 2020 to 2023, that has secured our connection to our water tower. That was a big concern in the 2015 report. That's no longer a concern for us. In the report too, they were also proposing membrane filtration for our water treatment options. It was a very emerging technology at the time to address potential contaminants. But what we've kind of learned in the last 10 years is that is a very expensive process and it is hard to maintain. And so that's not really a focus of what we're looking at right now. So in that report, it talked about rehabilitation, which means we would have had to take our water supply offline, purchase water from a neighbor during a full redo of our treatment process, and then bring our water plant back online. Now the conversations will be focusing on investment in our current treatment process, which eliminates that temporary water supply from somebody else. The water partnership opportunities have changed since 2015, and then as we've talked about, just regulations impacting how we're managing our production and distribution system, and all the other investments that we put into our water system. All right.
So one of the other things I think that probably changed is on slide 15, there's some numbers with cost.
Oh, yes.
And as I understand, it would be lovely if we can't we don't want to memorize those numbers because they would now look like a joke.
Correct. So these are 2015 numbers, as the asterisk says. And they're just different. They're very different because of the way that we're looking at the situation. I did want to just throw them in there as a reference. If we want to dive into this, we can. But my point is, so much has changed that while the topics, the 3 bullet points are very similar, our conversation is going to be different today.
And I would say the issues that surround each of the alternatives is somewhat different today than it was in 2015. And I think as we talk through this morning some of what those alternatives are or look like, if you quickly understand that this study was a study done in 2015 and does not reflect a study that we've done today or will do. The scope and options considered would be quite different today than they were then.
All right, so option 1, investing in our water treatment plant. I'm going to turn it over to Alex. He's going to give you guys an overview of the history of Glencoe's water treatment plant.
Thank you, Monica. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out today. So this is kind of a brief history of the water plant, where we started and where we're at today. In 1892, we had water mains that were installed and actually connected to connectors on new waterworks. And that's what supplied water to Glencoe until 1928, when a 3 million gallon per day water treatment facility was constructed for a cost of $500,000. In 1954, the plant was expanded to 8 million gallons a day, and that's when we still provided water to Northbrook. From 1990 to 2023, we've had various improvement projects that have been completed at the plant. We'll dive into that a little bit more in this timeline here. This is not a all-inclusive timeline, but more of a highlight of some of the major projects and accomplishments that have been completed over the years. So as previously stated, 1928, the original 3 million gallon per day water treatment plant was constructed and put into service. In 1931, the 500,000 gallon elevated tank was built on the west side of the Edens Expressway. That location was chosen predominantly because of us supplying water to Northbrook. The proximity made sense at that time. 1954, the expansion to 8 million gallons a day was completed. 1961, the 2 million gallon reservoir was constructed. That was built to increase our additional capacity. Also, kind of, again, driven by fire flow, making sure that we had enough water to supply our residents and the residents of Northbrook.
Does everybody understand where that 2 million gallon tank is under the tennis courts? Yeah. Like how far?
In 1974, filter 5 and 6 were rebuilt. Filters 5 and 6 were part of that 1954 expansion that brought our treatment capacity up to 8 million gallons a day. In 1990, the motor control centers were rebuilt. That's what drives all the pumps in the water treatment plant. 1996, filters 1 through 4, which were the original 1928 filters, got rebuilt. We also installed a diesel generator, and that diesel generator is capable of supplying power to the entire water plant, which will allow for uninterrupted treatment process for up to 24 hours on one tank of fuel. Our original SCADA.
Clarifying question, why were the filters 5 and 6 rebuilt 20 years after they were installed, but the ones from 1928 lasted until 1996?
I can honestly not answer that.
Weird.
But my assumption is probably new technology that emerged, and they made a decision. They switched from under drain pipes, which are literally pipes with holes drilled in them, and then varying layers of gravel to sand to anthracite for the filtration, and they switched to the Leopold under drain, which is a ceramic block with holes cast into it, and they get grouted in place. So my guess is those original pipes may have corroded, started to fail, and that's why they chose to rebuild them 20 years later. Now, my guess is those 1928 filters probably got rebuilt sometime between 28 and 96. I just don't have a record of it. So then also in 1996, our first SCADA system was installed. And SCADA is supervisory control and data acquisition that allows us to control the water plant, monitor data coming in, data coming out. In 2003, we made the transition from chlorine gas to sodium hypochlorite. The reason for that change is sodium hypochlorite, which is essentially bleach, much safer to work with than chlorine gas. In 2007, we had our South Clearwell baffles installed. What that achieved was preventing short circuiting of treated water as it enters the clearwell and leaves into the distribution system. It improves water quality. In 2017, our High Lift 5 diesel-driven engine was replaced. That's there so if there's ever a power outage, the operators are able to maintain pressure in the distribution system until the generator comes online and power is restored to the plant. We also performed what I believe to be our first ever intake cleaning, which consisted of 8 diesel-driven pumps placed on the beach and the reversal of flow through the intake to flush out all the sediment that had accumulated over the years. In 2019, our SCADA system went through another complete overhaul that consisted of completely replacing all PLCs, the computers, and actually even the software of the SCADA system to improve operations. In 2022, we either replaced or rebuilt all of the low-lift pumps and motors. We also had our elevated tank mixer replaced. The existing mixer was 11 years old, and everybody was astonished that it was still operational.
Can you explain that again? The existing what? What's the operation?
The tank mixer inside the elevated tank.
What's the very short version?
So the tank mixer, it mixes the water. So as the water enters the tank, it can stratify And in wintertime, you can get ice formation on the walls. So this tank mixer keeps that water moving, prevents it from freezing, and also keeps it mixed. In 2023, the entrance stairs were replaced going into the water plant, as well as a new parking lot installed. And that was kind of piggybacked off of the bluff wall construction. And we also performed an inspection of our 2 million gallon reservoir. Any questions about any of that?
These various junctions, when you've done upgrades, what typically has prompted those particular types of upgrades? Did you have a planned 5 to 7 year maintenance?
Most of it's
schedule?
looking at what's the current condition of the equipment. For the SCADA upgrade, for example, that was largely driven by a lack of support for the existing equipment that was on site. Computer software programs changed. We went from Windows XP to Windows 10, 11, and all of a sudden those software programs are no longer compatible. There's equipment that you can no longer purchase because it's legacy equipment. So if any of that were to ever fail, now we're left with nothing.
The other component to that is the village also has a 10-year community investment program. And although we haven't been heavily investing in the plant, pending the outcome of this conversation, we do also look out into the next 10 years of what needs to be done, so we can plan for that as well.
All right, diving into our existing infrastructure. Our treatment process consists of an intake that extends into Lake Michigan, approximately 3,300 feet, and is 25 to 30 feet below the surface, depending on lake limits. From there, water flows into a suction well via gravity, and then is pumped into the water plant via 4 low-lift pumps. I'm going to kind of skip over the treatment process, and we'll come on to that in the next slide. As Monica previously mentioned, we have emergency interconnects in the distribution system with Winnetka, Highland Park, Northbrook, and we also have the capability of supplying water to Northfield as well. 500,000 gallon elevated tank and the 2 million gallon reservoir. So our treatment process, from the low lift pumps, the water gets pumped into the rapid mix. There, it's mixed with coagulant. The coagulant allows the small particles in the water to flock together so that they become heavy and settle out of the water. After the low lifts, the entire process is all gravity until the water enters the clear well and gets pumped into the distribution system from our high service pumps. After the rapid mix, the water flows into a flocculation basin where there's large paddles that keep that flock suspended in the water so it has time to form and get heavy as it moves into the sedimentation basin. After the water moves through the sedimentation basin, it heads to one of our 6 filters for filtration. As the water passes through the filters, it heads into our clear well where it gets its final dose of sodium hypochlorite for disinfection, and at that point, it's ready to be pumped into the distribution system. From the rapid mix to filtration, that's about a 4-hour process.
Question? Yes. When we pull water in out of the lake, is there concern about the zebra mussels or other changes in the lake? I don't know if we're going to have other critters in the lake or not, but would that gum up the works?
So if we feed sodium permanganate at the cones of the intake, that's an oxidizer. And what that does is that prevents the zebra mussels from attaching to the intakes. And then there's also stainless steel grates that prevent large debris or large fish from coming in as well.
Good. Thanks.
So currently, our capacity is 8 million gallons per day. Over the last year, we averaged about 1.6 million gallons a day. In 2023, the maximum amount of water we treated in a single day was 3.7 million gallons. The maximum rate that we pumped last year was 7.4 million gallons. So that's the instantaneous volume of water we were pumping last year. On average, it's 182 gallons per person per day in Glencoe. What our demand is really based off of is fire flow, irrigation. Our demand has decreased over the years, largely due to redevelopment. So as more efficient fixtures get installed in homes, that demand continues to decrease. You know, toilets used to use 6 gallons every time you flushed them. You know, now they're down to about 1.6 to 0.8 gallons. Shower heads, faucets, you know, all of those have become reduced flow. So that continues to reduce our overall demand. Yes.
What about in-ground irrigation systems? Do you monitor that at all?
In what sense?
How much that draws on the water demand or decreases based on new technology maybe that's in irrigation systems or not?
We can monitor it in a sense through, now that we have smart meters, we're actually able to track hourly water use. The operators, as they're operating the plant, they know in the summertime, once 2 a.m. hits, they're ready to kick on extra pumps because they know we're going to go from here up to here for the next 6 hours as irrigation systems kick on.
Do you see any reduction of that as a useful goal?
That kind of comes down to the individual homeowner. I mean, we're always, you know, promoting conservation. So, and I think with the smart meters, I think the fact that we now have a consumer portal available to the residents, that they're able to track and monitor their water usage, they have that ability to recognize I'm watering too much, and they can reduce not only the duration or the frequency of what they're watering, they can set alerts for maximum water consumption in a day.
Is that used?
I use it.
I use it.
Because I've never heard of it.
Okay.
I'm not a landscaper, so I'm surprised that.
And you know, all new irrigation systems, they're required to have rain sensors installed, be water sense regulated. We also have regulations that restrict watering, you know, even odd days based on your address. No watering from noon to 6 p.m. when the sun's at the highest point and you're more likely to have evaporation than effective irrigation.
I think there's no doubt irrigation is one of our biggest drivers of use. It just is in this community. It's I think a broader conversation that perhaps as we go through, you know, plans down the next few years, we should be having with the community. But it's at this point in time, it's really a data point that we want to focus on and help the community understand when we do have those max days. In many cases, it's not because people are drinking more those days.
Let me just add, capitalism could have impact. I mean, the water bills in the summer are large, and so you know, we all know that, and you know, so it makes you think. I don't know if anybody's changed anything yet, but it's very expensive to irrigate. You know, we get $1,000 water bills, so that's an incentive to look for other stuff, whether we can or not. You know, whether people want to have desert instead of grass, but very.
And we'll talk about rates in a little while and some of the pros and cons of conservation efforts and what that means for the overall water utility and creating a revenue stream. But it's not nearly clear that if you do one thing or another, it's best or worst. I think that's the kind of the interesting part of the conversation. So we'll talk about rates in a little bit. Howard, you are right. They are not low.
All right, moving on to the water treatment plant critical near-term projects. Currently in the 10-year CIP, we have approximately about 1.2 to 1.5 million designated for civil and site work. And that predominantly consists of, the exterior, stucco, tuck pointing, windows, doors, roof, concrete rehab around the facility. It's critical that we keep the entire facility watertight to preserve its lifespan. Other things that are not currently in the CIP in terms of funding, but that are kind of on the needs list, are electrical and generator upgrades. Rehabbing filters 5 and 6, as we said, they were last done in '74. They still produce excellent water, but we're kind of at that stage where it's time to be done. Interior upgrades and improvements, valve replacements throughout the plant, the dehumidifier system, which protects the pipes, because as you get the temperature changes in the water, they sweat, water leads to corrosion, which is why the pipe coatings is so important, and also site security as a whole. Additional long-term projects depending on what path we choose to go down. Redundant raw water intake. Rehabbing filters 1 through 4 again. And then again, kind of looking, this is more in that 25 to 50 year, we'll be looking at more valve replacements, dehumidifier again, pipe coatings, cybersecurity upgrades, potential climate change, resiliency, and dealing with future state and federal regulations that may come up that are not on our radar currently.
So, one of the things I just want to point out with the separation of these two types of projects that we've listed out is some of these are big investments that we would put into the plant. Meaning, we're not going to want to rehab filters 5 and 6 to only use them for another 5 to 10 years. That's a 20-year lifetime project. Same with the generator. The last time we replaced the generator was in
96.
96. So, if we're going to replace the generator, it's a significant cost. We're investing in the plant in a way that we're ensuring its operations for the future, but it's a long-term investment. It's a higher dollar value project. These projects are also significant investments that we would need to make. I'm going to go into this a little bit later, but we have a single intake into our water plant. A lot of our neighbors have dual intakes, meaning, at some point it's probably going to make sense, instead of replacing our intake, to add a secondary. That's an expensive project. We're talking tens of millions of dollars. But that is a worthy investment if we want to keep our plant running and operational. But it is a significant investment, and that's kind of why we wanted to just make you aware of there are high costs to owning and maintaining a water plant. And I think we've gotten, we do a very good job. Alex and his team do an amazing job of maintaining the plant. I mean, you were asking about how do we know what we need when we need it. We're constantly monitoring, inspecting. That's just part of our annual program. But when we identify an investment into a project, there's going to be significant dollar values that are going to be spent to keep this running for a long time. We can't really get to the point of failure with water plant. That's not optional, and that's why we're talking about our interconnects, right? I mean, we never want to get to a point where we feel like we're risking failure on a water plant. That's just not an option. So a lot of our investments are proactive, and they must remain proactive. And part of the conversation is, we were talking about the options in 2015 of what's the future of our water supply. We're still talking about that today in 2024. Without a clear path and direction, there's some hesitancy on this big dollar value investments into the plant. And so I think that's kind of one of the points of the conversation. Again, no decisions today, but I'm just trying to drive home the point of why it's so important that we're talking about this. This is big investments, and we don't want to put, rehabbing filters 1 through 4, 5, and 6 in the budget for you guys to look at without understanding what that really means to the future of our water supply. So I hope that's helpful in the context of what we're talking about with the future projects that we've identified in investing into our water.
Just to add to Monica's point, we grappled with the concept of throwing dollar figures into these 2 slides, and we took them out because, frankly, they're guesses. And they're somewhat educated, but they're not educated enough. And I think what we're trying to just outline is that there is a scope that each option that we may anticipate will require a pretty significant amount of study, with alternatives built into the alternatives, perhaps. But I do think, as Monica said, especially this slide, you are talking tens of millions of dollars, and I think it's just a reality. I can't say that it's 20 or 50, but we know it's somewhere in that range. So, but we didn't want to try to put specifics to that because we just don't have enough information to do that well.
So I'm going to piggyback on the water plant investments just to talk about our water distribution investments as well. Because in reality, no matter what we decide to do with the water plant and our water production, water supply, we are responsible for maintaining our distribution system. So what we know in our current 10-year CIP plan, we have $16.5 million shown in our 10-year CIP for water distribution only. So compare that to what we have shown for the water plant, which is the 1.5. The cost to maintain our distribution system is significant. And I don't know what the future of the ratio is going to be between water distribution and water plant with our water fund. It could vary year to year, and it could vary and change as we grow. But this cost, this responsibility doesn't go away no matter what we do with the water production. So I just want to be clear on that. And these are all things that we've talked about, worked into our 10-year CIP plan right now is all the things we're working on. Our lead service lines, our leak detection, our water main replacements, and the engineering associated with that. What we see in the future for our water distribution system, though, is, the ongoing main replacements, investing into our interconnects. We'll have water tower maintenance, we'll have our underground reservoir maintenance, and any of the unexpected emergencies that will pop up over the years. All right, so that was investing in our water plant. Any questions? Okay. We're getting close to a break time, but I'm going to go through option 2, and then we'll take a break. So, in option 2, we're talking about rebuilding or relocating a water plant. And you've heard us talk about fire flow. This image shows our available fire flow for our water distribution system. But what I think it really shows really well is the backbone of our water distribution system. From the water plant to the water tower, we have a clear blue line there. That's the backbone of our system. We have transmission mains that run between the two. That's where we have the most pressure, the most volume of water, and as we span out, the pressure of our system changes. So I think one of the questions was from 2015, can we move our water plant to the golf course? on the part of land that we own. You know, would that be a possibility? Well, you're talking about moving the core production of water up to the northwest part of town, thanks, Phil. That significantly changes the pressure of our system, right? All of a sudden you'd see a lot more red down at the south part of the town unless you invested in more transmission main infrastructure, which is an expensive component to relocating the plant. So we could talk about relocating the plant or rebuilding the plant as just the actual plant infrastructure, but as soon as you move it from where it is now, the farther you go, the more dollar values we're going to add more infrastructure to keep and maintain this balanced system. Does that make sense? So, my conclusion here is it's not really a good idea to move it anywhere from where it is right now. I mean, we could, but there's costs associated with it. So the best idea.
The reason to move it is because people want the beach property, or because, what was it, 5 years ago when the water got up to the bluff? Is it an infrastructure, physical risk issue to move it, or is it a better use of land? Like, what would be the reason to move it?
I can talk just briefly about why we talked about moving it in 2015, and it was related to kind of the type of filtration system that we were contemplating. The membrane system. We were also looking at it from the standpoint of, without significant investment that would essentially be temporary investment to get water from another community while we rebuilt. If we were rebuilding on the same site, we were adding, $15 to $20 million in cost for that. So if you were able to rebuild a plant in the general vicinity around the existing plant, you could keep the old plant operational and then decommission it. But even that is an imperfect problem. Being near the lake makes the most sense, obviously, for reasons that, being able to just say the water's there, the treatment facility is next to it. But with the volatility of Lake Michigan, being directly on the shore isn't ideal necessarily either. And Monica will talk about this, but there's no available space, right? The amount of space necessary for a building like this and the necessary security perimeter around it that you'd want in a perfect environment is difficult to find and in this community, right? So I think a lot of why we looked at the possibility of relocation last time was because of what we thought we'd need from a footprint standpoint and what was available. But yeah, we looked at a lot of different ideas. We looked at, could we put it where the Public Works garage is? Could we put it on our golf course? Could we work with the school district or the park district and find a site that we could? And there's not, short of, when you look at the other slide that Monica had up, short of keeping something directly in that central diagonal blue line, it was very complicated and very expensive to do.
And the Forest Preserve, is that interesting?
And the Forest Preserve District has generally not
the park
been.
up top with the tennis courts is not known.
Well, we don't control it. I mean, in a perfect.
I'm with you. You said you were talking to public.
Yeah, I mean, we talked to the
Park
Park District about different alternatives. I think when you start talking about those kinds of changes, you start talking about bigger and broader community questions, right? So, what are you giving up to get, right? What is the value proposition for doing something like that? Because you would, while the space would be there, you would change the entire dynamic of how the community interacts with the lake. So, I think what we worried about in 2015 and what we continue to worry about today, if we were to contemplate a reconstruction of our plant, is where we could legitimately find a spot, how we would acquire the property, how much that would cost, and then what other ancillary components. It gets very expensive very quickly.
And how big is that site that you need?
We said, 1.
1.5 to 2.5 acres.
One and a half,
Yeah.
Yeah, and to the, Phil's point of moving it kind of along that blue band, the further away you get from the lake, the further your raw water intake needs to go.
Yeah.
So that's another cost too, that you just can't get away from. So the closer you are to your lake, then the least far your raw water intake needs to go.
And I think one other point to make, and we'll get into this a little bit later when we talk about partnerships. People say, well, what about building a bigger plant and then starting to provide water for somebody else? Bigger plants mean bigger footprints, mean also finding the neighborhood, the partner that's looking for another water source. When you have limited space, as we do, that gets exponentially more difficult to find. And if we were to double or triple the size of our plant in terms of its capacity, now you're talking about a much larger footprint overall, and that becomes more and more of a complex concept.
Question, can you build it in the lake? Isn't that what Chicago does?
That's a question that we haven't really talked through.
Jardine is unique in that aspect.
I think the Army
I'm not trying to
Corps.
be easy.
I think the Army Corps and the IDNR would have some concerns about an extension. Well, you'd essentially be building a pier. Like Jardine is immediately adjacent to Navy Pier, if you're not familiar with where it is, and it's half as long as Navy Pier itself. And you'd essentially be constructing something along those lines. I will say that given the already complex way that we have to get down to our plant, and we didn't say this, but when our plant was built, there was no road to get to it. We had a small little rail system that was installed that would take chemicals down to the lake, and then we had a staircase. When we worked with the Park District, I think it was in the 1950s, to install the current ramp system that exists, it's complicated to get stuff down there, as we just experienced with the crib wall replacement. I think you only add to the complexity if you're pushing something out into Lake Michigan and actually servicing it. If you need to get stuff down there. So it's certainly a possibility, but I think when we talk about costs, now we just added a couple zeros.
Somebody asked about what about where the tennis courts are, the reservoirs, that area up there, and certainly would change the lakefront look and interaction center. At the end of the day, depending upon what the proposal winds up being, if we wind up deciding it's best to rebuild the plant or build a new one, whatever other units of government may or may not want to do, I think this is going to be one of those, you go to the community and say, here are the alternatives. If we can do this, it costs X, and here's what your real estate tax bill looks. If we can do this, it costs Y, etc. And you present them, and hopefully everyone's working together, but people could have different ideas. You present it to the community, and they decide if they want to pay for potentially a much more expensive option, which could absolutely be the decision of this community to preserve the look and feel of the community and the autonomy that we have with our water. One could see people saying, yeah, my real estate tax bill is going to go up over the next 40 years, okay.
So I'm gonna ask, do we have a close-up of what our property, what the layout is at the beach? Are we gonna discuss like size of the front one? I saw the bubble over that.
This is our GIS.
Okay, so
Yeah.
where do our property limits go?
So, this is Park Avenue.
Yep.
The village's right-of-way extends all the way to the lake on Park Avenue and on Beach Road. This parcel here, where the plant sits, is village property, Park District property. the boating beach, and then the swimming beach is likewise Park District property. You may note, at some point in the past, we don't know when, the Hazel Avenue street end was cut off in terms of village control of it, and it became part of the Park District parcel for the swimming beach. But the space that the village controls is about that big. And then again, you have some up here, the beach road.
We don't have to much other than
No.
what we have,
Right.
where the building sits in the parking lot. So,
And if we go back to slide 15, which
how
is
many
talking,
acres is how big is the current parcel? You said we need a 1.5 to 2, how big are we?
Correct.
what are we?
I think our current is right about 1 acre.
Some
We
of the
need
big,
1.5 to 2 to rebuild, sorry, to meet our existing demand or generally?
well, I think one of the biggest problems we have is site security. Our water plant is uniquely insecure from the standpoint of how easy it is to walk up to. I think that's one of the components that you're looking at when you're talking about a different site, is you're trying to create a security buffer around it. I would say that the 2 acres is probably not necessarily the ultimate of what we want. I think we probably want more because of that security buffer around it. But I think, 1.5 to 2 is probably the best footprint for essentially a similarly sized scaled plant.
Yeah. I mean, and it's, I guess, in slide 15, and I could scroll all the way back, but when we talked about the 2015 study that was done, the construction of a new water plant, they actually looked at, rebuilding it on the existing site versus to the north, to the south, or a completely new location. So all of those options have been looked at in the 2015 study overall. So I think we haven't been able to move on that because there just hasn't been the opportunity. I mean, that land is not ours. It's not available to us to move it in any of those locations. So I mean, really with a rebuild, relocate, if we look at the area, the ideal load area, as we discussed, there's really just a limited amount of parcels that would even meet this need. None of them are within our control. So I think kind of the conclusion is, short of a unique opportunity that would be presented to us, I don't know that relocating or rebuilding are an option to us at this time. And we could talk about this some more, but I don't know that there's a lot that we would be able to figure out in this educational. I don't have any data on where we can move it to.
Yeah, I think as we look at options that relate to this, and as we talk further, post today, and we continue to kind of upgrade or update the information that we have, I don't think it ever falls off the table. I think this is still a viable alternative that could be something that we pursue. It is probably, it's like every one of the options that we're going to talk about, it's fraught with a series of drawbacks and issues that we would have to resolve in order for the best outcome to be reached. But difficult decisions are why we're sitting here today. This whole conversation is somewhat difficult from that standpoint.
I thought that we couldn't sensibly rebuild in a new location by ourselves.
So
And all the rebuilding that we've talked about.
When you say by ourselves, you mean
Glencoe,
just the village?
Glencoe. And I think that's what I understand, that's what Monica is saying. It doesn't make sense. And as I understood it, the rebuild, relocate stuff that we were thinking about was if we could find a partner among initially the neighboring communities that had the same issue, and that there was a theory that there are economies of scale having a bigger water plant.
So we'll talk about
But I assume that's
No,
three.
it's a good point, and I should have talked about it in this segment. But yeah, in 2023, we did a study with Strand again that looked at partnering with Glencoe. And the main focus of that was, can we work with them together to relocate or rebuild the water plant? And so what the study said is that if we were going to do that, like I was saying, the cheapest way to do that is to avoid that temporary infrastructure, right, that we would need for water supply. What they found in that study is that neither Glencoe nor Winnetka can support each other without significant infrastructure investment, unfortunately. Temporary infrastructure investment. So, meaning to say, if we were to hop on Winnetka's water supply and rebuild somewhere together, a brand new plant, and then go back onto that, that would be the ideal situation. They just found that that's not feasible. So, any situation, we would have to invest in temporary infrastructure before relocating or rebuilding. And the reality of the report also is there's not a real ideal location to rebuild as well. So, it is something that we've looked into, and the 2023 report was not motivating for either us or Winnetka to move forward with the options presented.
I think, so regardless of a partner or without a partner, we did look at this as a non-partnered option in 2015. That was the point of the conversation in 2015. And part of the reason, and we'll talk about this in the next segment, was potential partnerships and how those partnerships could lead to a significant cost share that doesn't exist today, won't likely exist again, and really drove a lot of that conversation from 2012 through 2015. Practically speaking, the numbers that we saw in 2015 study of a reconstruct of between 48 and 52 million dollars, those numbers are nuts. I wish, I think we're talking double those numbers today, and that's where it really becomes a significant question, because what we're now talking about is $100 million for the same thing, and I think that's a difficult pill to swallow from the standpoint of, we don't anticipate that there are partners, and we'll talk about this in a minute. We don't anticipate that there are partners that are looking for us to provide them water. And in fact, the opposite is probably more true, that there are partners who have the capacity to provide us water versus us being able to become a new player in the game, particularly without the space that we would need in order to have the production capacity.
All right, so with that,
I can tell you where you're getting land. It's not heavily involved in this. You're going to see churches close. So it's part of the business I'm doing. All churches. You're going to see, even where church is thriving, a state like North Carolina, we're closing 50% of the churches in the next 5 years. So where I work, we're involved in redeveloping. So we're going to be investing in redeveloping church land. So this is just to go rebuild churches later when youth hopefully rediscovers it. On Park Avenue, let's say that one of those churches closed, the Korean church or the Union church. Let's say that you have that ability to buy that land. Okay, so wouldn't it still be extremely difficult to move it from the beach to Park Avenue, harden it for use, even if land became available, historical?
it still would be a costly investment, to your point.
And that's
yes.
what, half a mile from that to like the Glencoe Union
Yep.
Church, for example, if they sold that.
Yeah, and I guess to your point, what I'm trying to say is the cheapest way to do it is to do it along the backbone, right? But even to do that, that's going to be an expensive endeavor. So yes, I mean it is expensive. I'm kind of saying anywhere outside of the backbone is just too expensive to even look at because of that temporary infrastructure. But yes, to your point, yeah, if there was land available, and I think that's kind of what we're saying is we don't know what the future is going to bring in the next 10, 20 years as far as potential opportunities that may pop up along here. And we'll have to keep an eye on it. We may have to pivot at some point and say, look, there's this opportunity. We could rebuild here. What do the finances look like that for us? And that might be something that we, again, would present as an option. But for right now, there is no unique opportunity. We're just kind of waiting for that to present itself.
By the way, I do not want to see a headline in the local paper that says we think we should take the Union Church property. Water plant there, we would be run out on a
Hopefully
rail.
anything that closes would be redeveloped for multifamily. That's
So, and I think there's a couple of other things to be mindful of. We didn't really touch on this too much. The existing underground reservoir that exists under Lakefront Park, we could not rebuild that in the same way that it is constructed today. We're not allowed to fully put those underground anymore. So if we were to reconstruct, it would be raised at least, I can't remember, 8 feet above. You have to have the ability to walk into it. So you're also talking about finding a piece of space that reservoir is big, but not big enough. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. We think we need more reservoir space if there are other alternatives that we're going to be looking at. So that is another challenge. I think regardless, there's a practical question here, right? You think about the Park Avenue, the land uses along Park Avenue. We're going to have to, if we were to relocate a building, it's not a metal structure that's going to, be plopped. This is one of our nicest streets with one of the best vistas of Lake Michigan. This structure, anywhere within this area, is going to be more expensive because it can't look like a water plant, right? Ours today doesn't look like a water plant. It looks like a Spanish fort. And that's good, right? There are a lot of people who look at that and just wonder what that interesting, attractive building is that sits on the beach. So I do think that those aren't costs that we've talked about either. What does the architectural significance of the new building have to entail as well? So this is complicated, right? That's part of why we're talking about it like this. There's no easy answer for this type of an alternative for us.
Well, two things. One is perhaps we could use part of the parking lot. I know that the park district would come unglued, but it's at least it's land that we own.
Which parking lot?
The parking lot in the right of way.
Oh, on Park Avenue, you mean?
Yeah.
Near the beach?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. The second thing, and this reflects my California experience, how confident are we that the technology is not going to change and we won't need as much space? The community I worked in California, some of our water was from desalinization. And I don't know the full elements of it. They said some kind of bags or something and they forced water through it or something. But there's new technologies out there that might be more compact. I don't know.
That's very possible. And I think that's something that as we continue to look at, but I think there's also just realities of how much water we have to, or how much space we have to allocate for water storage and other kind of pieces that they're just, water is as big as water is. So
I think, right, this is the general overview. If we did want to explore, relocating, rebuilding, I think we would have a much more concrete idea of how much space we need based on the technology we're going to use. But we're just saying, we currently have 1 acre, 1.5 to 2 is probably what we would need in general. But we would have to figure all that out too.
So you just say, what I've taken away from the presentation so far, and what I've gleaned, is that a realistic option for Glencoe, not cheap, is to maintain, upgrade, fix what we currently have. The second option of rebuilding and moving it someplace just for Glencoe, we don't think that's very realistic at the moment.
Short of a unique opportunity is the phrase I would keep using.
that none of us are aware of. And then the third thing that we're going to talk about next is partnerships.
Yeah, so we are at break. We all want to take a quick 5-10 minutes. We'll come back and we'll dive into the last option, which is a lot, but then we'll wrap up.